My name is Mike Shannon, and I am a semi-retired ministry professor. And I've had the privilege for the last 20 years to be the illustration columnist for Preaching Magazine. Having done that job for so long, people often ask me, where do you get all the illustrations? And I have to admit, sometimes it gets really close and I wonder if I'm going to find any more. But my goal today is to share with you some sources of illustrations. So I want to begin with personal experience. Now, I'll have to tell you that when I was young, I was taught not to use personal experience in sermons. And now, as time has gone on, it seems to me that some preachers, that's all they do is personal experience. Now, I'm for personal experience in that it helps you develop rapport with your audience, but I also want to make sure that if you use personal experience, that it is a good story, that it would be a good story even if it didn't happen to you. So be aware, have your antenna out for things that you experience in your life that might end up becoming a good sermon illustration. But beyond that, there are several places that we can go. And having done a column as long as I've done it, I'm always looking for illustrations. In fact, some people who know I do the column will sometimes pass me little notes with what they think would be good illustrations. So after personal experience, let's consider history books. If there's one criticism I've received since I've been doing this column, it's I had too much history in it. And that's because it's something that I enjoy. But I will tell you that when I read books of history, I always can find some kind of story that would be usable in a sermon. So take a look. It doesn't have to be a history textbook. It can be some other kind of history book, but they'll give you some illustrations, as will its close cousin here, biographies. Now, I like to read biographies, particularly of U.S. presidents. It's fascinating to read how they came to the presidency and how each of them had great qualities and not so great qualities. But it would be true of any biography you read. I would challenge you to read a biography and not come up with a good sermon illustration. One of the tricks of the trade I used to use is if I was reading a good biography and I came across a good story, I might say, well, that's a good story. I'm just not sure right yet what it illustrates. I made my own index in the back, assuming I owned the book and wasn't, checking it out from the library. But I would write down the page number of a story I thought might be helpful. So take a look at biography as a source of your illustrations. Another good source might be almanacs. What I mean by almanacs, it's like the World Almanac that comes out with all these statistics in it. Or there's a set of books called the People's Almanacs, and they have all kinds of interesting stories, and every once in a while one will capture your attention and you will be able to use it. Let's spend some time thinking about newspapers. Now, people don't read newspapers anymore, but you can still find them online. And when you read a newspaper, you have the advantage of using an illustration that's fresh, that people have been hearing about or talking about, and it makes your sermon more up to date. So I read my newspaper every single day, and I check every section to see if there's something in there. And what I'll do is I'll just tear out the story and I'll put it in a file. Now, since I mentioned the file, let me go down a side road for a minute and say, if you're going to get good illustrations in your messages, you need to collect them in advance of the need. That is, you have to have stories banked. You don't want to be searching around desperately so that you grab an illustration and put it into your sermon, kicking and screaming or crowbarring it into your sermon. So you could either use files or you could make computer files. And whenever you have a good possible illustration, put them in there. Particularly helpful is when you use a computer file, because you can then search for a particular story under a particular title or a topic that you've given it. Another good place, of course, is magazines. I know all magazines are having trouble these days. They're not as common as they used to be, but there's still a couple that will help you. One that I've found that helped me a lot is a magazine called The Week. And in that particular magazine, they always have interesting personal stories, stories that are kind of offbeat, and often I can get an illustration out of that. Now, there was a magazine that was by far and away the best source of illustrations I ever had, and it was called Mental Floss. That's right, you heard it right, Mental Floss. Now, not too long ago, the magazine itself went out of business, but they now have a website. And you can go on their website free, you don't have to pay for anything, and find interesting stories on almost every subject. So try magazines or website from the magazines. Now, I mentioned earlier about personal experience, but there's another category here, and that's personal observation, where it's not something that happened to you, but it's something that you've noticed as you looked out. Maybe it was a funny sign in front of a building. Maybe it was some incident you saw in a store. So, personal observation. One place that is often neglected, but I think is great, is children's stories. What I mean by that is something like The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. If you can't get an illustration out of there, you need to find another line of work. It's great. But it's not just C.S. Lewis. It's many other children's stories that will provide great illustrations for you. Now, this next one may seem a very strange place to get an illustration, and that is in a hymn book. And I sometimes describe hymn books as, music slides that don't ever go down. There's always there, even if the electricity goes off. And I know we don't sing a lot of hymns today. We sing more of the worship choruses and praise choruses. But even if you don't sing the old hymns, the hymn book is filled with good Christian poetry. And you might be able to use those as illustrations. Now, I use illustrations in a very broad sense. Some people think illustrations mean just some kind of anecdote or story. But I think there's a lot of different types of illustrations, and these sources I'm giving you suggest various types of illustrations. I've also at times overused this by closing out sermons by either reciting or singing a hymn, but there's great poetry in there. Now, what about reading other people's sermons? Well, every preacher I know is generous with his material. He wants you to read it, and he wants you to make use of it if you can. But we don't want to plagiarize. We don't want to tell somebody else's personal story as if it happened to us. We still need to put in our own blood, sweat, and tears on writing the sermon. But for one thing, other sermons can reach you. They can teach you. You need to be preached to now and then, and other people's sermons can do that. But you'll also find that they may use an illustration that you would like to use. My rule of thumb is if they use an illustration, and I've heard it before, or it's in common use, I don't necessarily feel like I need to give attribution. But if it's something unique to that preacher, I will call him out by name as the source of the story in the sermon. So it can do double duty for you. It can help you in your own spiritual life, but in other people's sermons, you may well find good illustrations. Next, I would mention as a source, illustration books. Now, those, again, are not as common as they used to be, but they're out there, where a preacher has put together some of his best illustrations, or an editor has put together his best illustrations he's discovered, and you can take a look at them. If you don't see them out in common use today, you can find them in good theological libraries. Some people don't like using illustration books because, again, they feel like it's not really coming from their own soul, their own mind. And so a lot of people don't like to use them. I remember hearing of a famous preacher who said using illustration books is the last refuge of a bankrupt intelligence. But sometimes we have to declare bankruptcy. We have busy ministries. So if you're having trouble, that illustration book can be a big help to you. What has replaced the illustration books are websites. They're actually websites that store illustrations. You can go to something like sermoncentral.com. Not only find manuscripts of sermons, but they have an illustration section. And some preachers just casually put up their illustrations for people to read and to use. So that's a good use of the web. Now, I don't know what's going to happen with all this AI. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how it works. Kind of seems like it was magic to me. But if AI has a good use, it might be to say to AI, write me a good illustration about grace and see what happens. I don't know if that'll work, but some of you all might be willing to try that. That might be a legitimate use of artificial intelligence. Now, one place that you can go for illustrations is movies. You got to be careful here, though. We know that some movies, people would be distressed to know that their preacher actually went to them. And we also know that the ratings on movies are not always reliable. But if you're out watching a good film, you can use it. Be careful, though, that you don't have to tell the whole story of the movie just to make the illustration work. You've got to be able to have it as a unit on its own. Sometimes if you read good fiction books, even like mystery stories and things like that, mystery writers love to put their own interests into the stories. And so they'll often talk about different kinds of things that they're interested in, and that can be a source of illustrations for you, or of course, anything of interest that the characters might say to each other. Sometimes, of course, just like we can use mystery movies and fiction, television can be a source. Now, again, we have the same issue. Will people think it was inappropriate for you to be watching a particular television show? And if you use too many of them, they'll think that all you're doing is sitting around and watching television all the time. But there are shows that are beginning to be a little bit more faith-friendly. Not a lot, but a little more faith-friendly, and you could get an illustration there. Now, a lot of us really like sports, and so I have at times overused sports stories as illustrations. Particularly this happens during the Olympics, where they've got all these personal stories about the Olympians, the swimmer who had to overcome a bad case of athlete's foot and that kind of thing. Well, there's some great stories of people who have come back from injuries, or there's great stories of athletes who are themselves devout Christians and speak out for them. So read the sports page and you'll find illustrations. Next, I would suggest science and nature books. Now, you might wonder, what? How does that even work? But I remember I was reading a nature book one time about bees, and it talked about how bees, when they're in the hive, they will change positions, that the ones nearest the queen bee will move back where it's colder, and everybody moves up. And I once asked a beekeeper if that happens, and he said it does. So they're looking out for each other and keeping each other warm. I think I use that as an illustration that sometimes bees have more compassion than human beings do. You could read some nonfiction books. A book that I greatly enjoyed reading was about the astronaut program. It was called The Right Stuff, an excellent study of the Mercury astronauts. Things like that. You can get illustrations from them. Now, what about devotion books like The Upper Room or places like that? Well, that's primarily a source for your own devotional help in your own devotional life, but there's often a good illustration there. My wife loves to read devotion books, and occasionally she'll tear out a page and hand it to me and say, this will work in a sermon. And what about one of the strangest places to go? Comic strips. Comic strips. Now, there used to be comic strips that worked better than others. For instance, you can always get good ideas from Peanuts, with Charlie Brown and Snoopy and the gang. It's particularly good with the older comic strips because they often had religious content to them. Some of you might remember the original BC. BC is being done now by the relatives of the original, but the original author of BC was a devoted Christian, and Christian themes sometimes come up in them. Obviously, things like, The Family Circus, or Dennis the Menace, they will provide funny illustrations for you. And so take a look, read them. If you don't want to look at them in the paper, you can go to a website like gocomics.com and you'll be able to see all the major comic strips. One that has particularly been helpful to me, because it's not in the paper, I have to go on Go Comics to see it, is Ripley's Believe It or Not. I have gotten many illustrations from Ripley's Believe It or Not. And sometimes you have to wade through a few of them before you find one that you say, okay, I can use that. Now, when you look at all these sources, I don't want to overwhelm you with them, but when you look at all these sources, if you have your antenna out, you will find illustrations. And the best illustrations come from your own hard work, from your own searching. And I mentioned earlier having some kind of system to keep the illustrations together in advance of the use. So all of these sources I give you are great, but not if you don't collect them ahead of time. Sometimes, as I said, you might just tear it out. If you own the book or the magazine, tear it out. Sometimes you might have to type it out into a word processor and save it that way. So everywhere you go, there are illustrations to be found. Everywhere. There's no excuse now for only using one kind. Again, when I was younger, I used to hear preachers say, don't build your sermons more than 3 stories high. What they meant by that was no more than 3 illustrations. Frequently, when I was preaching full-time, I would have many more than 3 illustrations if you count all the various types. I didn't even mention quotations. You could go to something like Bartlett's Familiar Quotations and find some interesting illustrations to use. So I want to remind you that when people leave your church, they're probably not going to remember that clever outline that you have. I love clever outlines. I like to write clever outlines. They may remember one point, but they're not going to go home and say, I'm going to remember that outline. But I've had many people tell me, I'll never forget that story you told. If it's a good story and it makes the point, that's what they're going to go home with. Now, one other piece of advice, and when you're using an illustration, is don't tell an illustration and feel like you've got to explain the illustration. If you have to explain the illustration, it wasn't a good illustration. Now, you may use one sentence to kind of summarize it and move on. But in the end, I once heard a student say, well, I've got my sermon. I just haven't found the illustrations yet. Well, my response was, then you don't have your sermon. You've got an outline for a sermon, but you don't have the sermon if you don't have the illustrations. The great thing is, many of the illustrations are stories, and everybody likes stories. So I hope this can help you as you want to improve your preaching, to find new ways and new places to find illustrations that will liven up any sermon.